Welcome to Life Rebounding. Thank you for joining me here today. We're continuing to look at the priceless Lamb of God, and today we're looking at the tender Lamb of God. And we're looking at Isaiah 53, verse 2, and the first part of verse 2, where we read, "He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground." Well, I'm not much of a gardener. I actually killed a cactus one time. My wife had given me a little cactus to keep on my desk at my office, and over time I managed, by neglect, to kill it. So I'm not much of a gardener, not much of a green thumb. But I do know the signs of spring. And one of the telltale signs of spring for me is when we begin to see the first shoots of the crocus leaves coming up out of the ground that's been covered in snow and frost for so many months. And it's always such a welcome sign. Well, that's one of the indicators that Isaiah gives us of the time of the suffering servant, the priceless lamb. He speaks of the suffering servant as being one who grew up like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. And that to me is a sign of spring. But what he's picturing in particular is a nuisance plant. A nuisance plant that never actually gets a chance to reach maturity. And truly, if you look at Jesus Christ as the Lamb of God, you have to recognize that for many people, he was a nuisance plant. He was an irritation. The Lamb of God, the suffering servant, would be a nuisance to many, and his life would be marked by adversity. It would be marked by rejection. It would be marked by premature death. And it would be a life that grew out of dry ground. And that dry ground that Isaiah is pointing to is a dry ground in terms of how dry and sterile was the spirituality of the day in which Jesus lived and walked the earth. It was a reference to how hard the religion had become of the Pharisees, who had turned it into legalism, where everything was governed by laws and rules and regulations, and little was about relationship with the living God. It was a barren place. It was a lifeless place. There was nothing life-giving about the relationship, about the religion. And yet out of that dry, barren ground comes this tender shoot that is Jesus Christ, the priceless Lamb. He wasn't hardened by the sinful world that he lived in. He wasn't hardened by experiences of dealing with sinful people. In spite of his rejection by human beings, by those closest to him who would run away when he's crucified on the cross, he is not embittered. He does not grow hardened. And he does not turn to law and regulations to govern his life. He remains tender. And I think one of the reasons that we have to conclude why he always was a tender shoot was because he was tenderized by his relationship with the Father. A relationship that he maintained daily by contact. You always hear Jesus saying, "I don't do anything that I haven't seen the Father doing, and I don't say anything that I haven't heard the Father saying." It was about doing the Father's will. And knowing the Father's will is about maintaining contact with him, maintaining that relationship. And so the Lamb of God was indeed a tender shoot rising up out of dry ground. Just like the prophecy had said that there would be a root that would rise up out of the stump of Jesse from 1 Samuel 16. And so there's a reminder to us that God can raise up life even out of barren places. And that might be a reference even to where you are today. Maybe you're in a place in your life that's become barren, become lifeless, dry and parched, hard. Well, there's life that can be held out for you, and there's a hope for life that can come into that barren place for you through Jesus Christ. There's a reminder to us also that God chooses the weak things to do his work, and we are indeed weak. I can testify about that myself. It's the tender shoot that he uses. And so, as we are reminded about these things today, let's remind ourselves it's not easy to be a follower of Christ today. There's a lot of influences in this world that would dull the sharp edge of our faith, of our relationship to Christ, of our values that we live by way of the kingdom. for the world is always trying to tease us with its values to lessen ours. But let's remember that in spite of the difficulties we face in being followers of Christ today, it's not opportunity to become bitter or cynical or hardened, but the Lamb's way is to stay tender. And can I challenge you and me today to maintain a relationship with the Father that allows us to have a tenderized heart, tenderized by His love for you and for me, and tenderized by His love for the world to which He sends us. Well, may we be tender shoots where God has placed us.